Hey guys, it's Dawn with W+9, and in today's video we're going to be doing some watercolor backgrounds featuring our new Pure Color spray mists. I'll be sharing one on regular cardstock and one on watercolor cardstock as well, and this will just show you the difference in how this ink moves around and how it reacts with water. We will also be featuring the encouraging words stamp set along with our new mists, and we're going to be using a slightly different technique than you might be used to when creating watercolor backgrounds. I'll be heat embossing my sentiment, so I'm treating my cardstock with an embossing buddy bag first just to remove any static. This will keep that embossing powder from sticking anywhere I don't want it. I'm going to be using the It Won't Be Easy, but It Will Be Worth It sentiment here in this set. This set has a lot of great encouraging sentiments, and I really love the graphic feel of it. I'm going to go ahead and ink this up using Versamark ink. This is a clear sticky ink and it gives the embossing powder something to stick to. I'm working on 100-pound W+9 white cardstock. This is a pretty thick cardstock and it holds up to the water that we will be using very well. I was surprised that there wasn't any pilling at all. I wouldn't recommend it for heavy watercolor, but for what we're about to do, it's perfect. I'm using a stamp press and those grid lines to help me line up my sentiment, make sure that it's perfectly centered and straight. Since we won't be adding any extra layers to this card, it's really important that the sentiment be straight and centered. It'll be very obvious if we have it off even by a little. Here I'm using white fine detail embossing powder. My stamp was a little dirty, so some of the ink transferred, but that's okay because I am embossing in white. If you were using clear, you'd want to make sure that your stamp were really clean so that you didn't have any color transfer. I'm going to let my gun get nice and hot here, and then I'm just going to heat emboss this. Once that powder is all melted, we'll have a nice surface here to start our watercoloring. That embossing will resist any of the watercolor. And then I'll just hit it from the back to counteract any warping. To create the background, I could spray directly onto the cardstock, but I'd get a lot of concentrated color in one area, and it would be very difficult to move it around. So instead I'm going to use a stamp sleeve to help me apply the color to the paper. Now these are the ones like you buy at Simon Says Stamp here. They come several to a pack. I think it's 50 to a pack, and I really don't feel like I'm wasting anything because I can reuse this over and over again. And you could certainly just lay the color onto your craft mat and then flip your cardstock over and pick it up off of the craft mat. But the advantage to this is I can see where I'm putting that color. I'm not blindly applying color to my cardstock, so I have a little more control with this method. So I've put some water onto that sheet, and now I'm using the spray mist to just drop some color into those puddles of water. Now you do not need a lot here. A little really does go a long way. It looks like there's no way that's going to cover all of that paper, but trust me, watch what happens when I turn this over and press it onto the cardstock. See how that color just spreads? I mean, I just, I love watching it because I think it looks cool. But I'm going to use my finger and I'm going to help move that water and color around. And where there's more color and more or less water, it's going to be darker. And where there is more water and less color, it's going to be lighter. So it's going to create this great watercolor effect. And I didn't need any brushes. I didn't need any experience or expertise or know-how. I'm just squishing this color onto the cardstock. And I can use this several times, just keep picking it up and repositioning it until I'm happy with how it looks. And that embossing on the sentiment is going to resist all of the color, so the more color we lay down, the more apparent the sentiment becomes. And I can continue to add layers of color with different techniques here. I'm going to use just the nozzle, the end of the nozzle, to flick some extra splatters. This is going to give me some harder, darker concentrations of color. And then I'm going to add some more directly to the sheet, and I'm not going to dilute it this time. I'm going to press it directly onto the cardstock anywhere that I think that I just needed to help those words come forward a little more. So by adding that little bit of darker background, it helps push that sentiment forward. I wanted to add a little sparkle to this, so for that I'm going to be layering the shimmer spray directly over top of this. You'll want to give the spray a good shake to get all of that shimmer agitated within the solution, and then I'm just going to spritz this on top. Now this is not going to alter the color at all, like I mentioned, and it just creates this lovely layer of soft shimmer over the entire image. It's absolutely gorgeous. You can see here in the picture how it's catching the light. I wish it photographed. I wish it could come across on video even, but it's just, you know, shimmer is so hard to capture. I'm just going to remove any excess from over top of the sentiment itself, and then I'm going to set this aside to dry, and I'll show you how we do it on the watercolor paper. So the technique is pretty much the same, but your results are going to be a little bit different because of the texture of the watercolor paper and the fact that watercolor paper keeps pigment and water on the surface of the paper a little longer so that you can move it around more freely. Cardstock, on the other hand, absorbs that water and color almost immediately, so you have a little less playtime. I personally think that both mediums are awesome, but it's up to you and what supplies you have on hand. This time I've wet the watercolor paper first and now I'm adding my ink directly to the stamp sheet. And just like before, I'm going to press that onto the watercolor paper and then use my finger to help move it around by rubbing it along the back side. I'll continue to lift this and lay it back down and lift it and lay it back down until I'm happy with how it looks. I'm going to keep creating layers of color. Again, I can pick and choose where I want to put this color by only touching the areas that I want to the paper. And while these mists are still wet, I can continue to add water and help move them along and blend them in with other colors. Once they're dry, I won't be able to do this. They do not reactivate with water, so I want to do all of this work while they're still wet. If I have too much water, color, or an area that I just don't like the way it mixed, again, I can use a dry cloth to just dab some of that away. And I can add more color to areas if I want to. As long as it's all still wet, the color is going to blend beautifully with the other colors, but if it was dry, I could then simply add another layer of color on top, and they're not going to muddle together and get muddy. But as long as they're wet, I can continue to work with them and move them around as much as I want. Here you can see that they will continue to flow and spread out, and I can even take some areas and pull them out similarly to the way that you would do with a traditional watercolor. And because we're working on watercolor paper, we do actually have a lot more time than we would if we were just working on regular cardstock. On cardstock, this would most likely be dry by now, and I wouldn't be able to pull and play with this quite as much as I can at this point. And I'm just going to set this aside to dry, and now that our other background is dry, I can go ahead and finish up this card. We'll be adding some triangles to the background using the Just Geometrics triangle stamp set and our white pigment ink. Now this is a great, very bright, very opaque white ink, and it works wonderfully going over other colors and on dark cardstock. For this particular technique though, I'm using the pad a little bit on the dry side because I do want it to be a little more subdued, and I just want to add that subtle pattern to the background. I'm going to stamp it once in the lower right, and then I'm going to re-ink it and stamp it again up in the upper left. And this gives me that extra layer of subtle pattern that I was looking for. It just adds a little more depth to the background. This triangle set also has a couple of pattern triangles in it, and one of them happens to mimic the design that's used in the sentiment of this newer set. And this is something that I do quite often. I will take a stylistic design from an older set and incorporate it into a newer set. And this just helps to really keep those older stamp sets that you might already have in your stash relevant and encourages you to pair them up with your newer stuff. And I'm going to use the same treatment as I did for the sentiment. So I'm going to stamp these in Versamark and heat emboss them using Wow's Bright White Detail Embossing Powder. I can use that previously stamped image as a guide and just overstamp a couple triangles. By adding all those layers of stamping and the mist, we've created enough interest that you really don't need to do much else to this card or add any more layers. So I've cut that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 1/4 inches tall, and I'm adhering it to a cashmere cardstock base at 5 1/2 inches by 4 inches wide. So this is just a little bit narrower than a standard A2 card base. And I am just such a huge fan of this color combination. The cashmere paired with our sweet nectar is just gorgeous. It's soft and feminine yet warm. So for the next card, I used pretty much all the same elements, but I switched it up just a bit. I'm using those same cluster of triangles, and this time I'm stamping them in Memories dye ink in black. And I want this one to have a more eclectic feel to it. I'm going to be gathering the papers together. So this time I'm going to stamp it once full strength, and then I'm going to go ahead and stamp it again without even re-inking it. And this gave me exactly the look I was going for. So now I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to add my sentiment, and I've decided that I'm going to be adding it on vellum. So I'm going to go ahead and rub this down with an embossing buddy because vellum is notorious for holding static. So you'll definitely want to use something to keep that powder from sticking where you don't want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and treat this with the embossing buddy bag, and then I'm going to go ahead and do my stamping and embossing. I'll trim off the excess and then gather these together and clip them with the clothespin. I'm creating a 4-bar card this time, so it's 4 7/8 of an inch tall and 3 1/2 inches wide. I wasn't really crazy about the bare wood, and I wanted to pull that black from the stamping in the background to the foreground. So I'm using the 100 black Copic marker just to color in that clothespin. Now I have not personally experienced any problem with it messing up the nibs of my markers when I color these or the wood veneer shapes, for instance. But if that's something that you're worried about, you might want to use something else like black paint or possibly the black enamel or glossy accents. And I'm doing the exact same thing to the Studio Calico wood veneers, and then I'm going to adhere these to the card front using some glossy accents. And that entire bundle has been adhered to a coal mine cardstock base, and that is the newest color that we just released using some 3M foam tape. So hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas on how to use our Pure Color spray mists. There's a lot of different techniques you can try, and this is just one of the less messy versions. And I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, don't forget to thumbs up. YouTube is more likely to show videos that you interact with in your feed. So be sure to thumbs up if you liked it. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find more information in the description box below. You can connect with us on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com. You can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. Again, all links are available in the description box below, so if you're looking for anything including the supply list and links to our blog, just click on that little expand button. Thanks guys. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.